Today is June the 6th, 1993, the 49th anniversary of D-Day, of the invasion of Normandy in 1944. I went ashore that day with an infantry regiment and was in Normandy until the fall of Cherbourg on June the 27th. That was nearly half a century ago, but I still remember many of the things that happened during that 3-week period. I often think about my many friends who died in France and are buried there. No one realizes more than I do how much they sacrificed for their country. I am making this tape today so that there will be a record of what I saw and what happened to some of my friends. During World War II, I served in the European Theater and in the Asiatic Pacific Theater of Operations. I was wounded in action twice and spent 13 months of my military career in Army hospitals. I was retired from the Army as a captain because of permanent physical disability as a direct result of enemy action. My name is Paul L Massa, and I live in Newark, Ohio. I am a realtor and I sell commercial property. My wife, Gladys, was also in the Army during the war. She was a registered nurse stationed at Nichols General Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. We met there while I was a patient, and we were married in the hospital chapel. We are the proud parents of 6 children who are now married and have their own families. I was born in Mansfield, Ohio in 1922, and I grew up there. My dad was a member of the American Legion, and patriotic events were always on our agenda. As a Boy Scout, I would sell poppies every year. On Memorial Days, we placed American flags on veterans' graves in the morning and marched in the parade in the afternoon. On the 4th of July, we always had a lot of fireworks. Every Armistice Day in November, we always went to the dinner at the American Legion Hall. I was attending Ashland College in Ashland, Ohio, when the United States entered the war. Ashland is about 14 miles from Mansfield, and I drove back and forth to attend classes. I wasn't old enough to be signed up for the draft at that time, so I took a Greyhound bus to Columbus and enlisted in the Army at Fort Hays. When I got there, a large group of young men were at the front gate waiting to get in to enlist. Some of them were signed up for the draft, but they didn't want to wait for their number to come up. All of these men were there because they wanted to fight the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. I have often thought if anyone had ever tried to burn the American flag in those days, they never would have lived to tell about it. It was a proud moment for me when I took the oath and became a soldier in the United States Army. Basic pay for an Army private at that time was $21 a month. I remember figuring it out that would be 70 cents a day coming in, rain or shine. After I was processed and received my uniforms and supplies, I was shipped to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. In fact, a whole trainload of us went to Fort Sill for training in the field artillery. In April of 1942, I was promoted to corporal. Then I was sent to the Field Artillery Officer Candidate School. I was commissioned a second lieutenant on August 11, 1942. I was assigned to the 42nd Field Artillery of the 4th Motorized Division at Camp Gordon, Georgia. The division eventually was redesignated as an infantry division. I was promoted to first lieutenant in January of 1943. The 4th was a well-trained division, and all personnel were proud to be members. The division was shipped to Florida for amphibious training, in addition to the routine training that an infantry division usually gets. In January of 1944, we sailed out of New York for England. We sailed on the George Washington, a large troop ship. We had about 5,000 men on board. There was the 12th Infantry Regiment, the 42nd Field Artillery Battalion, and the 4th Engineer Battalion. It took 10 days to cross the North Atlantic. The days were gray and dreary, never any sunshine. The waves were monstrous, the largest that I've ever seen. From the middle of the ship, you could see the stem twist one way and the stern twist the other. Many of the ship's crew were seasick. We had one experience I'll never forget. When we were docking in Liverpool, I remember someone hollering that they could see some women on shore. As 5,000 men rushed to that side of the ship, it began to list. The captain got on the loudspeaker and told everyone to go back to where they had been. After we arrived at our base in England, I was transferred to Naval Shore Fire Control, the 286th Joint Assault Signal Company of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade. After training as a naval gunfire spotter, I was placed in command of a Naval Shore Fire Control Party and transferred to the 1st Battalion of the 12th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division. The 4th Infantry Division was a triangular division composed of 3 regimental combat teams. Each combat team consisted of an infantry regiment and a battalion of light artillery. The division also had a reconnaissance squadron, a battalion of medium artillery, and an engineer battalion. There were times in Normandy when the engineers were used as combat troops to fill in the gaps between the regimental combat teams. Each regiment had 3 infantry battalions. Each battalion had a headquarters and headquarters company, 3 rifle companies, and 1 heavy weapons company. Each rifle company had 3 platoons of riflemen and 1 weapons platoon. Riflemen carried an M1 semi-automatic rifle, a short bayonet, and 60 rounds of ammunition. The heavy weapons companies had 30 caliber heavy machine guns and 81 millimeter mortars. The weapons platoons in the rifle companies had 30 caliber light machine guns and 60 millimeter mortars. Each regiment also had a headquarters and headquarters company, an anti-tank company, a cannon company, and a service company, and a medical detachment. The 12th Infantry Regiment embarked for the invasion from Plymouth, England. I'll never forget the feeling I had that morning as we marched down to the harbor. I felt the power and strength of a seemingly endless line of armed men moving in a column of 2s down the long, winding road. I remember thinking that the Germans would never be able to stop us. Little did I realize then that most of us wouldn't make it through the first week. My Naval Shore Fire Control Party boarded an LCI along with one of the rifle companies, Company A of the 1st Battalion. An LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, was a small ship that could transport about 250 troops and their equipment. Our ship was manned by Coast Guard personnel. My detachment consisted of myself, a naval officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Everett Pease, and 8 men. Lieutenant Pease served as an advisor to the battalion commander on naval gunfire capability and supervised the radio communications. My job was to stay with the rifle companies and visually direct naval gunfire. Corporal Fishman accompanied me as a radio operator. After our ship got underway, we learned that D-Day may be postponed because of the weather. Our ship, along with a number of others, sailed up a little river and finally anchored many miles inland. We played cards, we watched the seagulls, and we spent many hours just talking to each other. Finally, towards the evening of the second or third day, I forget which, the ship's engine started up and we began to move out. I decided to hit the sack and get as much sleep as I could. I was wide awake and well rested when it was time to get up. It was still dark when we loaded into LCVPs, landing craft, vehicles, personnel. A small boat large enough for several vehicles or a platoon of infantry. When we shoved off, my boat began moving in a large circle. Other boats joined us and followed after they had been loaded. Finally, all of the boats in our circle, 10 or 12 of them, formed a straight line with their bows pointed toward the shore. Their engines roared and we were off. Wave after wave of small landing craft loaded with 4th Division troops began hitting the beach at 0600 hours. First was the 8th Regiment, followed by the 22nd, and then the 12th. The immediate objective was to buy as much real estate as possible to secure the beachhead. I was tall enough to see over the side of the boat. It was a rainy, dreary morning. In the distance, I could see the outline of the French coastline. All along the coast, I could see small flashes, enemy gunfire. There were no jokes now. Every man was alone with his thoughts. I had been headed for this moment all my life. My dad was a veteran of World War I. As a youngster, I spent many hours in the attic looking at his uniform, dreaming of the day when I would be a soldier. Growing up during the 30s, I read newspaper accounts of German and Japanese military conquests. I listened to news reports on the radio and watched the newsreels at movies. I also saw most of the Hollywood war movies. For an English class at Ashland College, I wrote an editorial advocating that Japan was our enemy and that the United States should declare war before they attacked us. 2 months later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. I was standing behind the ramp in the front of the boat. Corporal Fishman was there with me. Eventually, the boat came to a stop and the ramp dropped. I hollered, "Let's go," and charged off the ramp. Suddenly, I was in the water up to my neck. I heard Corporal Fishman say, "Hey, Lieutenant, do that again." It was a good thing that every man had 2 pneumatic life preservers. I had inflated mine before the ramp went down, just to be on the safe side. It looked like a long way to the beach, but we were all motivated to move fast. On the beach, we saw quite a bit of debris and a few vehicles that had been hit by shell fire. A couple of them were still burning. We could hear machine gun fire ahead of us and the boom of big guns. We crossed the beach. Behind the beach was an area that had been flooded by the Germans that we would have to cross. At times, the water was up to our necks. The men from the 1st Battalion were headed for an assembly area at a crossroads about 2 miles from the beach. I passed through a wooded area that had been occupied by the Germans. It looked to me like the area had been bombed about supper time the day before. There was an overturned kitchen wagon, a dead horse, and a number of dead German soldiers. It looked like they were having spaghetti when the bombers arrived. The night before D-Day and before H hour, this area behind Utah Beach was scheduled to be bombed by our Air Force in preparation for landings by the 82nd Division paratroopers. I saw something at that location that really puzzled me. One of the dead German soldiers didn't have any pants on. At the time, I thought maybe the blast from a bomb tore his pants off. However, I soon learned that there may have been another explanation. As time went on, and I had one terrifying experience after another, I learned that you would never have to worry about constipation if you had the living hell scared out of you periodically. This could be a real problem in a situation where you would wear the same clothes night and day for weeks at a time. Also, there were no restroom facilities on the battlefield. I'm sure that the dead Germans laying around the kitchen wagon had a terrifying experience with 250-pound bombs bursting around them. The German in question probably got caught with his pants down. When I got to the assembly area, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jackson had the battalion organized and ready to attack. Colonel Jackson, the battalion commander, was a West Point graduate and one of the most impressive officers that I have ever known. No matter what happened or how bad things were, he never lost his cool. When the 1st Battalion launched its attack, we didn't have to go looking for Germans. They were there waiting for us. In the early hours, we had casualties and we took prisoners. When a soldier goes into battle, he still has a lot to learn. If he thinks that he learned everything while in training, he is wrong. In combat, he must learn fast if he wants to keep on living. That first day, I was way out in front with the scouts. I was looking for targets to direct naval gunfire at. I quickly learned that the ominous electrical crackling noise that I heard was enemy machine gun bullets going past my ears only inches away. I tried to contact by radio the ship that had been assigned to provide gunfire support for the battalion, but without success. It was a British Monitor with one turret of two 15-inch guns. I learned later that it has sustained a muzzle burst during a fire mission before H hour and had returned to England for repairs. One of our missions was to relieve units of the 82nd Airborne Division who had landed in this area. The few paratroopers that we found had had a rough time. They told us about Germans murdering their men who got tangled in their parachutes. There were also German units on the ground firing at the paratroopers as they glided towards the earth. Many of the paratroopers didn't have a chance. In a beachhead assault, the assault units hit the beach and moved inland as rapidly as possible. They must get off the beach quickly because there is wave after wave of troops coming behind them. As units move inland, the beachhead is expanded like a big mushroom. If an infantry battalion hits an enemy strong point that it cannot knock out, it would bypass it and let the next unit coming up behind them take care of it. Rather than front lines, we had front areas. Often, the battalion could have enemy units to the front and to the rear. To make the situation more confusing, individual enemy soldiers would become snipers from concealed positions after their unit had been overrun. This situation often caused supply problems for the battalion during the attack. Machine gun and mortar ammunition had to be hand carried by personnel because it was impractical to use vehicles in these areas. For all practical purposes, an infantry battalion was out of ammunition when it was out of machine gun ammunition. The first day in Normandy belonged to the riflemen and the machine gunners, both ours and the Germans. The Germans were dug in and waiting for us. Our riflemen had to root them out, and it was bloody business. I really don't remember being hungry that first day. Usually I had a very healthy appetite. Maybe it was the excitement. Eating was an individual activity in Normandy. There was no company mess. Each man carried K-rations, and whenever the opportunity presented itself, a soldier could open his box and have his meal. He could eat it all at one setting or spread it out over several hours. The separate components of the box were individually wrapped. Toward evening, the battalion went into a perimeter defense position for the night. It seemed to me like the Germans wanted to keep on fighting, or else they just didn't want us to get any sleep. That night, American glider troops began to arrive in our area. The gliders were large and could carry at least a platoon of infantry. One glider crash-landed near the ditch I was trying to sleep in. A country with small fields surrounded by hedgerows was not a good place for gliders. Most of the gliders that I saw had crash-landed. The next morning, at 6 o'clock, the 1st Battalion resumed its attack. We were headed for the village of Edmondsville. I could see a church steeple, and I was sure the Germans were using it for an observation post. Now it was time for naval gunfire support. Corporal Fishman turned the radio on. Lieutenant J.G. Bob Turner at Naval Shorefire Direction Center assigned the USS Tuscaloosa for our fire mission. The Tuscaloosa was a heavy cruiser and had 3 turrets, each with 3 8-inch guns, about the equivalent of 3 divisions of field artillery. I got on the radio and gave the necessary information and map coordinates and the command, fire when ready. Almost immediately, the Navy radio operator said salvo, meaning the ship had fired 1 gun for adjustment. Navy guns have a high muzzle velocity, and their projectiles are large and have a flat trajectory. This first shell got everyone's attention as it came screaming in. The explosion was loud and spoke with authority. It was bigger than anything we had seen or heard so far. After I heard the explosion, I wondered how I would be able to see over all the hedgerows to see where it had landed. It turned out that this was no problem. Almost immediately, I could see smoke and debris rise up on the far side of the church. I got on the radio right away and ordered fire for effect. There was no need for any more adjustment. The first round was right where I wanted it. The ship fired all of its guns for 3 volleys. The Navy radio operator said salvo, meaning that 9 rounds were on the way. Then almost immediately, another salvo, followed by a third salvo. That was really an impressive introduction to naval gunfire. So impressive that it scared the hell out of our own troops because they didn't know what it was or where it was coming from. They felt a lot better after they learned that it was the U.S. Navy. Naval gunfire was really awesome. The projectiles were larger than anything the division artillery had. Then too, division artillery had howitzers and the Navy had guns. The high-velocity shell from naval guns always made a very impressive entrance. We remained on the outskirts of the village until the following morning. During the night, the Germans shelled the field where I was every 30 minutes. The time interval between barrages was so exact that I could tell to the minute when the next one would arrive. The enemy shelling that night was an uncomfortable experience for me because shells from one enemy gun were landing about 10 feet from the ditch where I was trying to sleep. I would have liked to move, but there was no way of knowing if any other place would be safer. The next morning at daylight, the Tuscaloosa dumped another 3 tons of high explosives on Edmondsville. After that, 1st Battalion Riflemen moved through the village with no resistance. I was frustrated trying to see anything in a country filled with hedgerows, so I decided to use the church steeple as my observation post. Corporal Fishman strapped the radio on his back, and we went up into the steeple. There was a wood stairway part of the way up, and then a ladder the rest of the way up to the belfry. The steeple was the best observation post that I have ever had. I could see our men because they were on the move. I didn't see the Germans. They were dug in and well concealed. I got busy and directed naval gunfire at everything that looked like a worthwhile target. That included crossroads, bridges, and wooded areas. About 3 miles away, I saw a long column moving very rapidly across our front. It was moving too fast to be men on foot. Through my binoculars, I could see that it was German troops on bicycles. The Tuscaloosa had dropped some shells in their vicinity, and they were moving out at top speed. I could probably see more of the Normandy terrain from the steeple than anyone else in the 12th Infantry could see. I could have given the battalion commander some valuable information about enemy positions, except that my radio could only communicate with the other radios in the Naval Shore Fire Control network, and not directly with the Infantry Battalion. We had one problem in the steeple that I had not anticipated. Rifle squads from other units following the 1st Battalion were moving into the village. I saw the lead scout of one squad stop in the middle of the road and point up to the steeple. Then every man in the squad began firing at the window in the steeple. Corporal Fishman had a good voice. He had one hell of a strong voice. Fishman cussed them, never saying the same thing twice, and using insults that I had never heard before. The shooting stopped immediately, and the squad moved on. Before long, more troops moved into the village, and the friendly fire started again. Corporal Fishman gave another performance with the same results as before. This is called friendly fire, and it happens in modern warfare more than anyone realizes. The only thing I can say is that if Corporal Fishman and I had been with the soldiers down on the ground, we probably would have been shooting at the steeple. Enemy snipers were a real plague in the early days of the invasion. We'll take a break now and turn the cassette over to the other side. Years after the war, I saw a picture of the church where I had directed naval gunfire from, the church in Edmondsville. The caption under the picture said, quote, "Get the sniper in the steeple." The 1st Battalion's attack was really beginning to roll, so we climbed down from the steeple and started after the battalion. When we passed over ground that the Tuscaloosa had shelled, we saw a lot of dead Germans and a lot of bicycles. I looked at one dead German soldier who was lying in the middle of the road. His helmet had come off, and I was surprised at how young he looked. The thought occurred to me that his mother in Germany was probably praying that he was safe, and here I was looking at his body. I've often thought about the German soldiers. They were brave men and fierce fighters. I had a healthy respect for the German infantry as fighting men. At one point, the 12th Infantry had pushed ahead until it was well out in front of the 8th and 22nd Regiments. Our supply lines were unprotected, and the regiment was in danger of being cut off. The plan then was for the regiment to move back a couple of miles after dark. The United States Infantry never retreats. A maneuver like this was called a retrograde movement. That night, about midnight, we lined up in a column of twos and moved back until we were on line with the other two regiments. The Germans never realized that we had left the area. In fact, they shelled it several times after we had moved out. The 1st Battalion had suffered nearly 60% casualties by the end of our first week in France. Our rifle companies were barely good-sized platoons. The battalion maintained this viability by holding on to the automatic weapons. If a machine gunner got hit, a rifleman would drop his rifle and pick up the machine gun or mortar, as the case may have been. It seemed like everyone ended up carrying an automatic weapon or ammunition. The first time we got replacements, we got 650 men. They were clean-shaven and had clean uniforms and equipment. They really looked good, but I knew how they felt. They were wide-eyed and very quiet. While on their way up to our position, they had been shelled and had a few casualties. Some of them had only been in the Army about 6 months. They handled themselves well and put on a brave front, but I knew that they must have been terrified. Death was a new experience to me. I really had never thought much about it before. I had never seen anyone die a violent death before I landed on Utah Beach. I'd never seen anyone die. It was a subject that young people just did not think about. Ever since I joined the Army, I never had much input into what I should do or why I should do it. I simply obeyed orders. There was a saying that I often quoted. It is not for me to reason why, it is but for me to do and die. When I landed on Utah Beach, I realized what the hell I had been saying. That was actually the deal. While we were on the LCI, sitting, waiting for the weather to clear, I got to know Captain Holton, the company commander of Company A, and we had some very interesting conversations. Captain Holton talked a lot about his sons and the plans that he had for them after the war. He showed me pictures of the two boys. One was 4 years old, the other 6. In one photo, the two boys were standing with outstretched arms. On the back was written, "Hurry home, Daddy, we miss you." Captain Holton was killed near Edmondsville. His 2 sons would have to grow up without their father. I had been in the 4th Division for 2 years before Normandy. I had known some of these men for a long time. In the Army, you eat together in the same mess hall 3 times a day. You drill together, go on pass together, sleep in the same barracks every night. I knew the names of the towns that many of them were from. I had met their wives and children in the States. In the Army, you develop very strong bonds of friendship. It was always a very upsetting experience for me to see the dead body of a close friend. Once I was in the middle of a field when I heard a lot of machine gun fire on the other side of the hedgerow. A rifle squad that was crossing the road got caught by a German machine gunner. The BAR man stood in the middle of the road and slugged it out with the machine gun. BAR stands for Browning Automatic Rifle. The BAR man was killed, but he got the machine gunner. First Lieutenant Davenport of D Company was an eyewitness to the fight. Lieutenant Davenport told me that he was going to recommend the BAR man for the Distinguished Service Cross. I have often wondered if Lieutenant Davenport got the recommendation in before he was killed in action. Once, while we were getting shelled, I jumped into the nearest ditch. There in the ditch, I found a newspaper clipping, a picture of an attractive young woman and a small girl working in a garden. The caption told how Mrs. Natalie Pugash and her daughter of Tampa, Florida, were making a victory garden while First Lieutenant Joseph Pugash was serving overseas with the Army. This was a real surprise. Joe Pugash was one of my best friends. Joe and I had gone through officer candidate school together at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. When we graduated, we were both assigned to the 4th Division at Camp Gordon, Georgia. We went through Ranger training together, and we were both transferred to Naval Shore Fire Control at the same time. Joe was the Naval Gunfire spotter with the 3rd Battalion of the 12th Infantry. I carefully folded the clipping and put it in my pocket. How did Joe ever let something like this get out of his possession? I promised myself that I would see to it that he got it back. I was thinking about Joe when Corporal Fishman came crawling along the ditch. "Lieutenant Pugash is dead," he said. "His body is on the other side of this hedgerow." If Fishman had said that my own brother was dead, it would not have hit me any harder. By this time, I had seen too many dead friends. I couldn't bring myself to go look at Joe's bodies. Most of the fields surrounded by hedgerows were small, but once we came upon a large open meadow with a little brook running through the middle. On the other side of the field was a large clump of trees. German machine gunners, concealed by the trees, controlled the open ground. The Tuscaloosa was unavailable, so Lieutenant Junior Grade Bob Turner at Naval Shore Fire Control Center, assigned a ship that I had never fired before. The first round landed right in the middle of the trees, so I ordered the ship to fire for effect. The shells came screaming in, volley after volley. Most of them hit branches or tree trunks, exploding in the air with shell fragments reaching down into the foxholes. That put a stop to the German machine gun fire, as the unit was almost annihilated. At that time, I only knew the ship's radio call letters. I later learned that it was His Majesty's ship, the Black Prince, a British heavy cruiser with 4 turrets of 3 6-inch guns each, a total of 12 guns. The 1st Battalion had been moving parallel with the shoreline and headed for Cherbourg. During those early days, we were always within the range of naval guns. Naval gunfire and our maps were so accurate that I could usually fire for effect after the first round. Usually the ship's line of fire was directly across our front. It was important that I knew where the line of fire was before I ever changed deflection or elevation. Naval gunfire was easy to direct. After contacting the ship by radio, the first command I would give was fire mission, then a brief description of the target, such as enemy infantry, enemy vehicles, tanks, or fortified position. The target location was identified by map coordinates. The Navy would initially fire 1 gun for adjustment. If it was not right on the target, but usually it was, I could adjust by giving commands in hundreds of yards, like down 400, or right 200, or left 200. My final command was fire for effect. While 1 gun was being adjusted, all the other guns made the same adjustments in range and deflection, although they were not being fired. When the command fire for effect was given, all the guns were on target and ready to fire. The firing ship were always underway, sailing in large figure eights, and as it moved, the turrets and guns were always turned on the target. I was told that this was done with computers. Back in 1944, that was the first time that I had ever heard of computers. Captain Jim Peacock was a naval gunfire spotter for the 2nd Battalion of the 12th Regiment. Captain Peacock was wounded on D-Day, so after Joe Pugash was killed, I was the only spotter left for the 12th Infantry. When I wrote home and told my parents that I was in Naval Shore Fire Control, my mother was happy to hear that I had been transferred from the field artillery. She didn't like the idea of me being around guns, especially big guns. She thought that I was now in a fire department and that maybe I would stay in England for the rest of the war. My dad, the old soldier, knew better, but he always let Mother believe whatever made her happy. One morning we had tank support, and I thought that that was great. The tanks sprayed the trees and the hedgerows with their machine guns, and the battalion really began to move. I was about 100 feet behind one of the tanks when suddenly there was an explosion. At first, I thought that the tank's 75mm gun had fired. The tank stopped, its motor roared like it had slipped out of gear, and then the lid of the turret flew open and the crew scrambled out. All except one man. He was trapped inside, and I listened to his screams as he burned to death. After that, the other tanks pulled out. Otherwise, they would have been sitting ducks for the German gun that got the first tank. The tank burned for several days. After the third day, the engineers brought up a bulldozer to remove the tank. The lieutenant driving the dozer was a friend of mine. The same German 88 that got the tank got the bulldozer and killed the lieutenant. Once, the 1st Battalion launched a night attack on Hill 90. As I recall, a railroad track was our line of departure about midnight. The battalion didn't reach its objective and occupy the top of the hill until after daylight. It turned out to be a very expensive piece of real estate. The Germans laid down barrages with everything they had: mortars, screaming meanies, and artillery. Colonel Jackson, the battalion commander, and most of his staff were casualties. Many of the men on top of the hill were killed or wounded. I walked around the area on top of the hill looking at the devastation. There was little shelter, and most of the men had been pretty much in the open. Fragments from large caliber shells mutilated and mangled human bodies. Dead men had huge holes through their bodies and arms or legs torn off. One man was in a sitting position with the top of his head neatly removed. The inside of his head was empty, as though everything had been scooped out. I found fear to be a very painful experience. When I say fear, I mean the sheer terror that a man experiences when he thinks he is going to die. I prayed a lot in Normandy. I didn't pray that my life would be saved, because there were times when I was sure that I was going to be killed. I prayed that my soul would go to heaven. It was a very terrifying experience to be caught by an artillery barrage. I always hit the ground and made myself as flat as I could. I would have crawled into my steel helmet if I could have. I've had shells burst so close to me that I felt the heat of the blast. When the shelling would stop, there would be a few seconds of silence, and then you would hear the wounded call for an aid man. There were always some wounded. We all had the greatest respect for our medics, or aid men, as the wounded called them. Each medic had a red cross on a white background on his helmet, and a Red Cross armband. They answered the cry of the wounded, even if they had to expose themselves to enemy fire. Unfortunately, I don't believe that the highly visible Red Cross protected them, because many of our aid men were killed or wounded. The morale of our troops was remarkable. I remember one young fellow holding up the bloody stump of his left arm and saying, "Hey, Lieutenant, this ought to be worth a drink in any bar, don't you think?" And I agreed with him. I saw a sergeant that I had known for a long time. He was laying on his back. He had just lost his right leg below the knee, and an aid man was applying a tourniquet. I sat down beside him, lit a cigarette, and gave it to him. "Tough luck, old buddy," I said. He said, "No, Lieutenant, I should say tough luck to you. I got my ticket to the States now. You've got to stay in this hell until you get killed or wounded." The thought had already occurred to me, and I admitted that he was right. After Hill 90, the 1st Battalion went into 1st Regimental Reserve. We were now out of range for naval gunfire, so I contacted Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Edgar, commanding officer of the 42nd Field Artillery, and offered my services to him. The 42nd provided artillery support for the 12th Infantry Regiment. I had served under Colonel Edgar in the States, and he knew me. I will never forget his greeting when I walked into his command post. He said, "Massa, my boy, I thought you were dead." The 42nd had lost most of their forward observers, so Colonel Edgar accepted my offer and sent me back up to the 1st Battalion as artillery liaison officer. When I returned to the battalion, I reported to Lieutenant Colonel John Merle, who had replaced Colonel Jackson as battalion commander. The colonel and his advanced CP group were in a corner of a field waiting for tanks to arrive. After introducing myself to Colonel Merrill, I went over to the other side of the field to talk to a forward observer. He was a replacement officer who had just been assigned to the 42nd. This was to be his first taste of combat. The tanks arrived while I was talking to the lieutenant. I watched the lead tank as it came through an opening in the hedgerow. The tank bobbed down, and then it bobbed up, as tanks did when they crossed the ditch. Suddenly, the tank's 75 millimeter gun fired. I could hardly believe my eyes. The shell burst near the CP group, killing Colonel Merrill and several of his men. This was a terrible tragedy, and it was caused by friendly fire. At this time, American forces were closing in on Cherbourg. I was sent over to join the 9th Infantry Division, whose regiments held high ground on the edge of the city. The plan was for me to direct naval gunfire on targets around Cherbourg, and the ships, the firing ships, were to enter the harbor at Cherbourg. The Air Force was providing a lot of support for ground troops around Cherbourg, both with bombing and strafing. I had the unfortunate experience of being strafed by P-47s, and I'll never forget it. The sudden appearance of low-flying fighter planes roaring over at treetop level with all their machine guns firing is an intimidating sight. This was another case of friendly fire, but it may have been my fault. I had changed my position several times to get a better view, and I was never sure where the line was. I later learned that smoke used to mark the front lines had drifted and had caused the confusion. I also learned that one of the regiments of the 9th had some casualties as a result of the strafing. When the battleships and cruisers appeared out in the channel on the other side of Cherbourg, it was an impressive sight. I could recognize the Tuscaloosa and the battleship Nevada. This situation also posed an interesting gunnery problem. The Navy guns would be firing in the direction of our troops. A mistake in range would be a catastrophe. Enemy shore batteries along the coast began firing at the ships, and for a while they were busy firing directly at the shore batteries to protect themselves. As it turned out, there never was an opportunity to direct naval gunfire on Cherbourg. Units from the 3 American divisions surrounding Cherbourg were entering the city at various points, faster than I could plot their positions on my map. Most of the resistance ceased, except for a few die-hard holdouts. Cherbourg fell on June the 27th. While we were in training in the States, they always said, battle is the payoff. Well-trained soldiers would win battles. At that time, I often thought about what it would be like in battle. How would I react when I would see men killed or wounded? This really concerned me because it always upset me to see anyone injured, even a minor injury. Battle turned out to be more gruesome than I had ever imagined. It was not a case of seeing 1 or 2 individuals hit, but times when I saw 20 or 30 men killed or wounded within a few minutes, all young men in the prime of life. It was always appalling to see the wide-eyed, frightened expressions of young men who had just been wounded and didn't know how badly they were wounded or whether they would live or die. I was surprised when wounded men told me that they really did not feel pain. All the time that we were shooting at the Germans, they were shooting at us. They had the advantage. All they had to do was lie in wait in their concealed positions as we moved towards them. I thought that they were kicking the hell out of us because I saw more dead Americans than dead Germans. They were well coordinated. All too often we'd be pinned down by machine gun fire, and then they would really bring in the artillery barrages. The battlefield was a very impersonal place. I never got mad at the enemy. I saw friends get killed, but enemy soldiers were getting killed too. In Normandy, I looked death in the face every day. I was often terrified, but I was always able to do my job and direct effective naval gunfire whenever necessary. We had a great army because we had millions of good men. A good combat soldier is not a bully or a troublemaker. He is the average guy who always tried to do a good job. He's the man you can count on. I've often thought about Corporal Fishman. Fishman was a good soldier, always right there when I needed him and always ready to go any place I wanted to go to. He was a real jokester though, but he really just liked to cheer people up. Although I can remember when we were in the church steeple and he was sitting on the floor joking about how close rifle bullets were coming to my head. I knew that I was often the butt of his jokes, especially when I heard men laughing the loudest. But that was all right with me. I thought it was great to laugh, especially when there was not much else for a person and the person might be killed in the next few minutes. The early days of the invasion were very hard on me because many of my close friends were killed or wounded. At one point, I promised myself that after the war was over, I would look up their families at home and tell them what great heroes their sons or brothers or husbands were. That was one of my good intentions that I was never able to carry out. After we started getting replacements, most of the officers and men were strangers to me. Many of them became casualties before I even knew their names. It wasn't as hard on me emotionally as it was when close friends were killed or wounded. The things I missed most in battle were the small everyday creature comforts that I had taken for granted all my life. I missed walking on sidewalks. I missed sleeping in a bed with clean sheets or sleeping all night without being disturbed. I miss sitting at a table, eating a warm, cooked meal. I have been in other battles, but Normandy is the big one that stands out in my memory. I have never talked about it very much, but I have thought about it a lot. I suppose one reason that it stands out in my memory, it was my first combat experience. Initially, it was the shock of the overwhelming violence of being caught in an artillery barrage and seeing friends that you have just been talking to die. The sight of what large shell fragments can do to young men's bodies. I think about Normandy a lot at night when I'm in bed. I don't know if I think about Normandy because I can't sleep or I can't sleep because I think about Normandy. I have lived for nearly half a century since the Battle of Normandy. It has been a good life and a happy life for me and my family. I know better than anyone how much my fallen comrades have sacrificed for their country. When they lost their lives, they lost everything.